Hello friends, today we're going to be talking all about the melody. Yes, my favorite. How do we write better, catchy melodies that are going to be stuck in our heads for days after? So we've got 9 tips for you here today. Hopefully we'll turn you into the next Beethoven. And we're also going to link you below to our melody cheat sheet. There's also a small MIDI pack attached to that. Let's do it. So to start off, I thought it only made sense to listen through to what I think is one of the catchiest melodies of all time, the Windmill Hut melody from Ocarina of Time. So not sure if you guys are Zelda fans, but let's take a quick look. So definitely one of those that you could just listen to on loop for hours, right? So catchy. And let's take another listen and this time just kind of look at it visually. I sort of have just like a random serum patch here. And so what this melody is doing is essentially following the formula of A, B, A, C, right? Call, response, or call, response, call, resolution. And so when you're writing a melody, it's not something that you're probably going to do consciously, but when you've written a melody you like and you go back and look at it, you'll realize that you very often are following this formula. And so you can see here, right, in the first 2 bars, if I paste these notes over, it's going to be the exact same. So A and A. And then in the second 2 bars here, if I paste these notes over, see that it's slightly different than the last phrase. So we could essentially chop this up into quarters, call this A, call this B, call this A, and call this C. And again, I'll paste A over to A, the exact same. I'll paste B over to C, and you can see it's slightly different at the end here, right? So you could also just call this B1 and B2 if you want, since they're similar. Another way to think of this is call, response, right? So you're writing the melody, the first 2 bars, if you imagine almost like dueling piano players, if there was 2 people with the same piano patch in a room, and one guy or girl was playing the first phrase, and then the other guy or girl played the second phrase. Right? So that's what all melodies are following. Call, response. And then, of course, at the end here, you have a little chance for resolution to lead back into the start of the phrase. So you've just followed the formula. You've got a nice, catchy 8-bar loop, but it feels like something is still a little off with your melody. Well, it's very possible that you're just not giving your initial patch enough love. So if we go listen back to what we had in the green here, it sounds fine, but it's a little bit flat. It's a little bit static. That might work within the context of your mix, but a lot of times for lead sounds, I like them to be a little bit more inspiring. So down here in the blue, I've done just a little bit of sound design, really not much at all. So now when I'm pressing random notes on the keyboard, it's a little bit more inspiring to me than what we had initially. Not that the version in the green is bad, but I really like to spend the time picking a patch that is going to inspire me when I'm writing a melody, right? And you don't have to overcomplicate it. It might be as simple as choosing like a classical piano or a guitar, or it might just be realizing that it only takes like 10 minutes to fire through 100 presets, right? And you just find the one that gives you the tingles and boom, you're good to go. And by the way, doing a little bit of sound design to improve a patch only takes like a minute or 2, right? So all I did here is mapped LFO1 to the cutoff and the decay so that over the course of a half bar, it's opening up a little bit. And I also added some fresh air to give it some mids and highs and make it sound more like a lead. So now we've got a patch that we love. We know we're probably going to end up following the formula, a bit of call and response, a little bit of resolution. Now let's talk a little bit about vibe, right? How do we nail the vibe? So in the example we've been working with, it's this nice, happy, merry vibe, right? Very iconic melody. The patch fits the vibe. But let's say we wanted to make a darker vibe, right? Something completely different. Now Link is being attacked by a shark. So what are the components of vibe? What could we tweak? So if I paste this over, I'll just first call this our happy vibe. If I paste this over to this channel here, and we'll call this our dark vibe, one of the first things you can start to tweak is octave, right? Generally, am I working in the right octave? So we've been working here. We'll go down an octave. Go down again. Starting to feel a bit darker, right? But it's still, if we kind of look at the notes here, right? It's still kind of happy. We're going from E to E. So this is sort of like the emotional vibe of how the notes are interacting with each other, the emotional component, right? It's a very subjective thing, but you know, if Link's being attacked by a shark, we could go for the Jaws vibe, right? Two notes right next to each other to create sort of a dissonance. But we're still using a patch that we made for a happy melody, right? So I have a couple detuned pianos here. And let's see how we're sounding now. That might be too low, but... So now we're getting a little bit closer to the dark vibe, right? And let's keep going with this and look at now making a different type of vibe, like in a lofty type ethereal vibe for, say, an intro if you were remixing the Windmill Hut. All I've done in this channel here is I've taken our original melody and just muted a bunch of the notes to create more space, right? And I've also drenched out our initial patch in a bunch of reverb, so 60-70% reverb. And now we've got this. So now we've struck a vibe. We've got a nice 8-bar loop of something we're super happy with. But within the context of an actual track, it's usually not going to work for you to just paste this over 10 times, right? It plays throughout all the drops, the breaks, the breakdowns. In reality, you need to extend out your ideas via subtle variations and a couple of tactics that I'm going to share with you here, looking at one of my older tracks called Wheel of Time. So I've got the melody in MIDI here. Listen through and see if you can hear how the energy sort of picks up halfway through. So hopefully you heard how there's sort of a rise and a pickup in the energy halfway through versus the start you have this. And then. So when the pads comes in, essentially, there's a rise in energy. And I accomplished this by going up an octave, but also increasing sort of the pace or frequency of the notes. And then also adding some variations, right? I have sort of this A sharp, G little mini resolution within each bar. And so sometimes I'll just paste over my idea and go up an octave, and that works. But adding some subtle variations is a good way to extend it out and keep things fresh. And so if we look at this, this also applies not just to actual melodies, but in this track, I have a subline, which does something similar, except it goes from C2 to C1, and then kind of loops back up to C2. So this is a 16-bar subline instead of 8-bar subline. This works particularly well if you're working with C because, in my opinion, true sub goes from C1 to C2, essentially 33 to 67 hertz. Generally, that's going to make the ground rattle, depending on what system you're working with. But let's listen through to the drop here and see if you can hear, now just paying attention to the sub and the Reese, essentially, which are following this pattern, how there's a little bit of a shift in vibe halfway through. So again, if we compare the start to here. You hear how that is a different emotional tone to it. It's a lower note, so it's a bit darker. And it's sort of, the song saying, hold on a second, we're not done. The sub still has something to say. So keep in mind that your ideas don't have to just be 8 bars. They could be 16 or 24. You could be in a different time signature. Obviously, I've been working in 4/4, but you don't have to. And so that is a good way to kind of extend out your ideas within the context of a track. Another good way is the idea of checkerboarding. If we go back to our original Windmill Hut melody, you hear that they have one synth playing at the start, and then they have a different one playing later. So this is the idea of checkerboarding, which is essentially paste this over, but then have this be a different instrument. And that's another good way to extend out your ideas. So now I wanted to mention the importance of being as expressive as possible when you're writing your melodies. So we're writing music, right? And all good music conveys emotion. It conveys some sort of message. So when you're keying in your original melody, whether you're drawing it in MIDI or whether you're playing it out on a keyboard, try to be as expressive as possible and really put as much emotion as possible into your idea, right? So if we play just the first 3 notes from the Windmill Hut melody, we can play them back in different ways. We could add a little bit of counterpoint. So we're climbing up the scale right now with our 3 notes. We could go. Right? So you can have different amounts of space in between the notes, slightly different timings, a little bit of glissando when you press, 2 notes that are right next to each other, a little bit of dissonance. You can get very emotional with your melodies. So yes, get emotional on the keyboard. And if you're working in MIDI, let's say, you're not comfortable yet playing in notes and you want to just draw on your notes. Again, nothing wrong with that. In the example I just showed you from my Wheel of Time track, those were all drawn in, right on the grid, on the nose, and within the context of the track, it sounded fine. But let's say you want to add a little bit more of humanization. Well, you can go in to your patch. You can start tweaking some things. For example, your velocity sensitivity, right? If I wanted to map this to certain things, I could say when I hit certain notes harder, I've just mapped it to the cutoff. Now the filter will open more. And so subtle variations like that can humanize things a little bit. And really just never underestimate the importance of just simplifying and minimalism, right? If you go listen to someone like Hans Zimmer, the Interstellar main theme, he just found 2 notes. That wasn't the exact melody, but you get the idea, right? I think when he's starting a lot of his sessions, he just finds those 2 notes. Which ones are really striking a vibe? Back and forth. Okay, now let's go to the response. And it really is that simple. If you find yourself going down a rabbit hole and it just doesn't feel right, just delete everything and just find those 1 or 2 notes that you're really vibing to on the keyboard. Now let's talk about good old counter melodies, which can be just as important as the main melody. They're kind of like yin and yang, right? A really good counter melody will interweave perfectly and complement the main melody. And so let's listen to a few examples. I've got a little track here you might have heard of before, Strobe by Deadmau5, and see if you can hear the counter melody come in around here. Right, so it fits the vibe perfectly. It carries the track along. Another way to extend your track, right? If you feel stuck, you might need to just keep piling on some additional counter melodies. And so I have it in MIDI here just so you can see. This is kind of the main riff, and then you have your counter melody. right? Very simple. A lot of times your counter melody will be a little bit more sparse and simplistic than your main idea. Now I've got Sunday Song by Lane 8 here. Let's give this a listen. So in this case, instead of adding a different pattern, Lane 8 has just harmonized. So if we look at the MIDI here, you sort of have the main riff, and then he's just piled on some notes here. So another good technique for extending your idea, just listening back one more time. This can be a nice tactic too, because it's not going to clutter the mix anymore, really, right? You're keeping the same timing of notes. And so instead of just filling in the spaces, he's just harmonized. And then lastly, I wanted to mention Above and Beyond, because when it comes to melodies, counter melodies, they're really one of the best. If you listen to any of their tracks, you're going to hear a bunch of examples. And this one in particular, this is sort of an emotional track where this is kind of the intro with some like emotional piano. And I won't play the whole thing, but you'll see how they just kind of keep on piling ideas as you go. Right, all sorts of interweaving melodies, some going up, some going down, lots of great counterpoint. The pads come in and it creates, one unit, even though over time they're piling on a bunch of melodies. And so that's another thing to mention too, is right, you don't have to have one melody and one counter melody. You could have 3, 4, 5, and have some of them be more subtle and in the background, some of them be harmonized, and it just creates this one moving, interesting melodic unit. So we've got a bunch of technical tips here. And let's chat for a second about the metaphysical, right? How do you get into the zone? How do you get into the flow state that all of us are so addicted to as musicians? Well, I've got a few tips here. Number one for me is listening to music that inspires me. So just this past week, I was writing an idea for the desert region of a video game I'm working on. And I was feeling a little weird, a little uninspired. I didn't really know what to do, but I had this time carved out. So all I did was pop on the Dune soundtrack by Hans Zimmer, right? Just listened to 2 or 3 tracks and just transported me into a different realm. I felt completely different after just 10 minutes of listening to some music that I like, and went on to write one of the best tracks of my life. And so sometimes it's on us to kind of get ourselves into the right state. So you can also take a walk, right? Take a walk, go through the park. Or you can also just find an inspiration spark. And this might be even something like dragging in the MIDI from a track you like, right? I have MIDI from all of these Above and Beyond tracks because melodically they're one of my favorite. So sometimes I will just drag this in and see, okay, what did they do in Sun and Moon? And just looking at this visually for a bit might give me some ideas. Or maybe you can just start, reversing it and, changing around some of the notes, and now you've got your own idea. No one's going to know that you were looking at Sun and Moon, right? You're not directly copying Sun and Moon by the time you finish your track. So there's nothing wrong with that as well. And this kind of brings me into my next tip, which is to let the melody write itself. So, once you're at your keyboard, you've kind of entered flow state. Now it's all about just like turning off your mind. In my opinion, it's like you can really get in your own way. And if you start thinking about what am I supposed to press here, instead of not being afraid to hit some wrong notes, those are 2 very different paths. Usually when I'm having trouble writing some music, it's like I'm just getting in my own way, right? And so, I'm kind of thinking, how do I write a banger, or what are people going to think? And then when I surrender, let go of ego, something greater comes through. You make space for something to come through. So This is all metaphysical, lofty stuff. People describe it in different ways, right? In some of the Eastern traditions, they call it the state of no mind, where you feel like, you're not even playing the piano anymore. There's something playing it for you. And so who knows what this mystical state is, but I think we're all addicted to it as musicians. And so it's important stuff to think about. My last tip for you guys is to use brute force. So let's say none of this is working. You're sitting there frustrated. Well, sometimes it's on us as producers to sort of push through until we strike gold, right? There'll be some sparks coming up and all of a sudden, boom, we know that's the idea. So you can use a lot of Ableton's tools to just spark inspiration into your project. I have a tutorial out on the transform and generate tools in particular if you want to dive deeper into this. But let's say we wanted to have a melody go from C3 to C5. Well, we could just start generating random ideas. Less density, more density. And I'm right now locked to C major because if I have this purple button enabled up here, it's going to lock to whatever scale I have chosen here. There's also the shape tool. If we wanted a rising melody, let's say we wanted our melody to rise into the next section, well, we could just start throwing down that general shape. And so we're in the age of AI, right? There's all sorts of tools out there to generate randomness. Use these tools to your advantage. And, eventually you're going to have at least a snippet of audio that you like and can build on. Alrighty, y'all. That's it for the melody tips for today. I bet you that even Beethoven didn't know a couple of these, right? So you're ready to pop off on the keyboard. Just another reminder to join our mastermind community if you haven't hopped in there yet. There's a bunch of us making electronic music in there, and there's a bunch of free downloads as well. And I'll see you guys at the next one. Thanks for watching.